Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is the wonderful Helena Kennedy. Of These Shores.
Of the Shores, yes.
Which is the marvellous title. And
sounds so grand.
It is so grand. It's so grand, it's not true.
It's not true.
It's that old thing, Helena, is ask a busy person, and you are it. I mean, there are so many things you've done. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, glancing through your biography, I was sort of exhausted by the end of it. And I mean, you talk about public servant. It's absolutely amazing. You were brought up in Scotland, of course, for a staunch Catholic Labour family, I think.
That's right. South side of Glasgow.
Is that the good side?
Well, of course. In some ways, it's the sort of immigrant side, in that there were a lot of Jewish families there. There were lots of Irish immigrant families there, and as you moved out, and as people became sort of a bit more well-heeled, then they moved to the suburbs of the south side. And so, but we started off very much, I was born in a tenement building and lived in it until I was 10, with a 2-room and kitchen, as it was called.
And you were a close family?
Very close. I have 3 sisters. They still live in Scotland, still live in Glasgow. And I was the third of them. And I think that where you're positioned in a family sometimes makes a difference. And I was the child who was born after the war. My father had been away in the army for nearly 7 years, because he stayed on afterwards because he was with the intelligence corps, although he was a working class man, but he was smart and he was moved to it. And they were dealing with people in the aftermath of people who were being rounded up, who had been collaborators and so on, and there were issues about what you did with those detainees. So he didn't get home immediately, and my 2 older sisters are 9 and 10 years older than me. And then my mother got pregnant and had a boy who died in birth. And so I was the replacement of a son, and I was the first child my father ever was really involved with. And in the photograph albums, I'm the baby,
golden child.
I'm the baby in his arms. And then there was a little sister, my sister Therese. But
your father was surrounded by women when he came back.
Surrounded by women, and in fact he was a man who cherished that, actually, and he was a very lovely man.
And you then obviously did phenomenally well at school, and
I loved school. I mean, it really was where I came into my own, and I was well taught by teachers who were very committed. It was a big Catholic state school, but I had a wonderful classics teacher. I was taught Latin and Greek by him, and he encouraged me to debate. And I think that gave me a sort of foothold in what ultimately made me make the choice of doing law. I think encouragement came from him. And I went down to London and studied law and studied for the bar.
Would they ever have thought, almost certainly not, that you'd be starring in the coronation with the Queen's rod and dove?
Absolutely.
I mean, the head girl bit at Holyrood, I can understand, but
yeah, I was kind of tickled at the idea of what my mother, sitting on cloud 9, is making of all of this, or my father. My father would have been thrilled and incredibly proud, but my mother would have thought, "Oh, I hope this keeps your feet on the floor, and you don't get too big for your boots." My mother was very people would say to her, "How do you feel about your daughter now being a lady, Mrs. Kennedy?"
They were alive when you were.
My father died when he was only 61.
Oh, right. But your mother was alive when you...
she was.
When you became a peer.
Yeah, she lived until she was 93, and she came down for that, kept seeing people, and she said, "Oh, I thought that person was dead." She'd see Lord Callahan and people. Anyway, she was, but she was, and it was very, she was very tickled, but she's not a woman for effusiveness on the basis that you mustn't get too big for your boots, and you've got to... all of her daughters were ladies as far as she was concerned. But she was a doughty woman, and she was a great force in my life.
It was a great moment for her, but your legal career as a barrister was extraordinary, because you were straight into Myra Hindley as a junior, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean,
And this
I
was her plotting to escape, wasn't it?
yes, I'm plotting to escape from
Was this
prison.
in 74?
Yeah, I mean, and I was a baby barrister. I'd only been practicing for, I mean, I qualified in 1972 and did my pupillage and so on, and then was involved in setting up a new set of chambers, which was quite a radical set of chambers, Jonathan, and so we. And then I was instructed to be the junior in this particular case by a big law firm, and so it was.
And what was Myra Hindley like when
Well,
you met her?
I mean, you've got to remember that she, by this time, had been in prison a very long time, and she'd learned how the system worked, and she was very anxious to make sure that I knew that she was not some ill-educated person, and she wanted to immediately know what I was reading and what books I liked, and she wanted to talk about books more than she wanted to talk about her plan to escape from prison. She'd had a relationship with one of the wardresses, and
Oh, really?
and that was the nature of the planning.
And then you had Brighton bombing.
I did the Brighton bombing. Before I did the Brighton bombing, I did the Balcombe Street siege. It was the first big terrorist trial that I was involved in. I was still in my late 20s, and I acted for one of the defendants in that case. And those were a group of men who were involved in a whole set of offences, which they were gentlemen's clubs and so on were shot up, and they were accused of the Guildford well, they weren't accused of it. That was the interesting thing, was that in the course of the trial, they admitted that they were responsible for the Guildford and Woolwich bombings, for which people were already in custody. And it was interesting because that all came full circle for me, because many years later, I ended up as the trial counsel in the appeal of the men who had been convicted of the Guildford 4 appeal.
The Guildford 4, yeah.
And it was recognised as a miscarriage of justice, and that they had been wrongly convicted. And it was interesting because the men that we acted for in the late 70s were telling us that they had actually been responsible for that bombing.
Extraordinary.
So, extraordinary.
And in some ways it justifies what my next question was going to be, is, when you were given this sort of brief for someone who is a terrorist or something to defend them, it must be quite a struggle with your conscience, or not.
Well, what happens is that you've got to. It's a question that's always asked by members of the public. They're puzzled at the fact that you might end up representing people they would find reprehensible, and the thing you have to learn early on, as you're doing more and more serious crime, is that you can't. You're not only ever going to be acting for the good guys. And sometimes it's not for you to decide whether someone is a good guy or not a good guy. If someone is telling you that they didn't do something, or that they've been charged with something that is the wrong thing that they've been charged with, and they're not hiding some of the other rather ugly things that might have happened. But the purpose of the criminal justice system is to abide by certain rules, which are for the protection of all of us. And so you really do convince yourself that your role in this is to make sure that the trial is conducted in a fair way, that people are given the opportunity of presenting.
And the Brighton bombings, which was obviously the sort of attack on the Conservative government in Brighton, where Margaret Thatcher, and you were involved.
I was a junior counsel for the guy who was the commanding officer in that. I was led by, in fact, someone who's in the House of Lords now, who's a Liberal Democrat peer. But we acted for O'Donnell. And of course it went to the heart of government. I mean, it was a plot that had obviously been incredibly well planned, and the man who was convicted of actually placing the bomb, years later, it was so interesting that he entered into a whole process of truth and reconciliation, almost, with where he met with the daughter of one of the people who had been murdered, who had died in that bombing. And she wanted to understand what his motivations were and how the taking of a life could in any way help his cause. And I watched on television. It was so interesting to see McGee, the man who had laid the bomb, talking about it.
And civil liberties have been really at the heart of your
Yeah.
your activity, really. I
I mean, most
meant
of my
so
work
much.
has been in that field. I mean, for me, it's about
And
protecting
the
the
new
rule of
chambers
law.
you set up.
And the new chambers. I mean, I set up. I was involved in the setting up of a new set of chambers when I was very young, which was really when I was only newly qualified. A group of us who were had been hoping to get into a particular set of chambers hadn't achieved places, and we got together and said, "Well, let's set up our own set of chambers." I mean, I think it would be unheard of nowadays for that to happen with such young practitioners. But a group of us, 6 of us, 3 men and 3 women, it was, very unusual. There were very few women at the bar at that time. The percentage was something like 4 or 5%. And we set up a new set of chambers, and it burgeoned, and it's now a big set of chambers, Garden Court. But further along the line, I got together with another group, and we set up Doughty Street, which was in 1990.
Which was formidable.
Yeah.
Reputation.
It's of course, a lot of the work there is not just national, but it's international too. And now at the moment, more of my work is international. And I chair, I've chaired different organizations around international law and human rights, but I am the director of the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association. So that's where a lot of my work is.
So how much time does the bar take for you, or law take for
you? The law take
given
for me.
You've had so many other roles.
Well, I mean, I always think of it as being the central core of who I am.
Right.
And so even when I came into the House of Lords in 1997, and that was Jonathan, that was really as a result of people said to me, didn't you ever want to be a Labour MP or anything like that? And I have to honestly say, it never ever occurred to me, nor would I have wanted to. I loved the law. I loved being in court. I loved the business of conducting a case, having to have a strategy for how you conducted it, the research that went into it, and so on. And it's both it's got the drama in it, but it's also got the intellectual stimulus. And also it can effect a certain amount of change. The area where I like to think that I've made most change is around women in the law, because I did a whole set of homicide cases involving women who ended up killing a very abusive men who had abused them through their marital lives or through their relationships. I did a lot of difficult cases and cases involving young women, for example. I mean, it's harder to imagine now, but girls who got pregnant and who were so filled with shame and couldn't tell their parents that they gave birth and then destroyed the babies or threw them out of windows or put them in the bin, and then ended up on trial, and yet they were almost invariably suffering from mental health issues. And so
but there was obviously a tipping point where, I mean, clearly you'd had a heritage family upbringing, strong Labour, strong Catholic family. There was obviously a tipping point where the lure of academia, because you then went on to be Chancellor of Oxford Brookes, Principal of Mansfield College, etc., on the one hand at Oxford, and Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam.
Yeah.
So the academia on the one side, and then the politics. And I mean, I may be wrong, but the politics of becoming a peer helped you perhaps change the law in favour of the things you believe passionately in with human rights.
Absolutely. You see, what happened was that in the late 80s, there was a campaign that was established called Charter 88, and I was one of the original people involved in that. I didn't set it up, but others did, but I joined it early on, and I became the chair of Charter 88 in 1992.
And what did Charter 88 do?
Charter 88 was saying, let's have a new constitutional set of arrangements. And one of the things that people wanted to see was a written constitution. They felt that, and I know that you wouldn't share this, but this idea, but
you're putting words in my mouth.
No, but the strong feeling was that things had got out of kilter, and that there needed to be more constraints upon the executive. And so there were lots of discussions about whether our constitution was yet, doing the job. And so what one wanted to see was reform of the House of Lords. We're talking about it again. There was reform of the House of Lords, a Human Rights Act, because one wanted to see the incorporation of the European Convention of Human Rights into English law, British law, I mean, across the UK. And also Freedom of Information Act, also devolution. And those things were being debated everywhere. And I was very interested as a Scot in the idea that decisions should be made closer to home. I don't believe in Scottish nationalism, but I do believe that decision-making is better placed close to the people affected by decisions. And so I became very actively involved in this campaign. We tried to persuade Labour at an early stage before the 92 election, but it really didn't bite at that stage. But as the years passed into the 90s, I spoke to John Smith and I got him to speak on and to adopt the idea that there should be a Bill of Rights, the Human Rights Act. And then we persuaded. The big move actually was persuading Peter Mandelson that if there were going to be financial constraints if Labour came in 97, then the thing to do was to have an agenda that was imaginative and modernising, and that should be about our changing all these different things. That Labour was going to come in and change the architecture of Britain. And that's what we sought to do, and that's what brought me into the House of Lords.
So you touched upon the reform of the House of Lords with Charter 88. So it was a moment of triumph, I guess, when you were able to drive through the change of the hereditary status.
It was, let me be clear. I do think that the idea of having hereditary peers is if you like, the most, ridiculous facet of the House of Lords, that people should be there as a result of who they are and who their family are. And so what was negotiated was that in order to get it through, it's very difficult to get that kind of constitutional reform through our parliamentary system. And so, although Labour had quite a majority, it wasn't enough to do that. And so it was negotiated, and it was recognised there had to be a negotiation. And so 90 hereditary peers were given the opportunity of basically being life peers. Yeah. And so they, from their own number, elect who should come in. But I think that the time for that, it was always felt that was an interim measure. And I think that should go. And I think that we should be greatly reducing the size of the House. I think it should be maximum of 400 people. And I think that we should be thinking of it being a hybrid House in which there is better, if you like, representation of the regions, but also that you have expertise. I think you won't get scientists standing for election, but I think that scientists and people with medical expertise and good educational experts, all those people are needed in the House.
I agree. And I think that there should be de facto peers. There's far too many bishops. It's not representative of the religious feeling in the country. As you said, I don't buy this elected bit because I'm not sure they would turn out to be quite the caliber. As you said yourself, I don't think those scientists would stand for election.
No, so you have to have, when I say hybrid, I'm talking about a mixture, that you would have a mixture of both appointed because of their expertise and because you recognise a need or a gap.
Yeah.
And I think already there's a level of that going on, certainly for the crossbench peers, that they look and see, where is there a gap? Do we have somebody who knows about the film industry and who knows about the cultural industries and so on, and the importance of those to our productivity and so on, as well as our culture and our creativity. And then you need people who know about other things, and sometimes they're quite humble things. I mean, things like people who know about the teaching and the learning of the very young.
Yeah.
So, but it's about having experience, and I do think that I actually think the business of patronage has to go. The idea that prime ministers can create whole swathes of folk seems to me a thing that's had its time.
I'm probably a goner then.
Well,
but anyway,
you're under the wire now. You're in. You're in.
So. I've been there for about 18 years. But the really amazing thing was that Tony Blair Dawn of New Labour in 97. He chose 4 or 5 peers, all of which are incredibly impressive people. David Putnam, the great movie producer, probably our greatest ever movie producer. Valerie Amos, of course.
Yes, so wonderful international.
Patricia Scotland, yourself.
Yes.
All of which have turned through to make a big contribution in politics and during their time in the House of Lords. You were chairman of the British Council, for example.
I did that for 6 years. I loved it. That was a wonderful thing.
Just describe what the British Council does.
People on the whole inside Britain don't know what the British Council is. And yet if you go to India or if you go to large stretches of Africa and Pakistan, all sorts of places, everybody knows what the British Council is. And it's because it was about soft power. It's about people who wanted to learn how to speak English, people who wanted to know how there were lots of cultural links created between on music, on the business of theatre and bringing our theatre out to parts of the world, but also in exchange, we ended up making incredible friends for Britain.
It's the soft power, isn't it?
It is that business of soft power.
Yeah.
And of course, it's, when it comes to cuts, you see, to government, it's the sort of bit of government that ends up taking it in the neck. When in
Just
fact,
like the World Service
you
and
can't,
things like that.
and it's because, it's not readily measurable, but this stuff is really important. And we used to send out, our policing people who'd experienced and recently retired to work with people who were establishing, independent, policing in places. And I remember doing it, they did it in South Africa, sending out parliamentary draftsmen to help the new South Africa with how you draft legislation. And those exchanges on training and all sorts of things were just wonderful. But they made friends for Britain and friends for life. And I think that we've been neglecting that end of what we need to do if we want to have our place in the world, as we talk about.
In a post-Brexit Britain.
In a post-Brexit Britain, particularly.
And the Commonwealth is another one which obviously I'm biased when I say.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, it's very important that we do all those things. And the British Council has been very present around the Commonwealth, but also in places like, if only we'd been stronger and been able to do a better job in some of the places in Eastern Europe, to strengthen the rule of law. I mean, one of the things about that we recognise for in the world is the rule of law, because we have such an incredible judiciary.
Yeah.
And our system is so well respected. And it's why, commercial cases come to be resolved in Britain, even when it's not a British company that's a party to the contract, but they come to resolve contracts and they put them down as the venue for resolving disputes should be Britain, because our courts are of the highest caliber. And, it's not seamless. You've got to remember that that's why it's important that your criminal courts are good and that you deal with all manner of law in ways that hold that candle alive and bright.
Tell me about the Helena Kennedy Foundation.
Well, that was an interesting thing, and I've always been very collaborative, and when I became a QC in 1991, the year afterwards I was asked to take part in a national commission on education, and it was basically that I was this working class girl who'd somehow managed to sort of climb the heights.
I think the working bit's very fair.
Anyway, and so what happened then was that I was on that National Commission on Education, and the bit I was on was because it was cradle to grave. We could probably do with it again, but it was I dealt with the bit on higher education and further education. One of my sisters left school at 15, but she went back into education after she had her children. She ended up through going to further education college, went to university, and then became an English teacher and the head of an English department in a big school. And those opportunities, those long-term second chances for people are so important. So Gillian Shepherd contacted me after that report came out and said, I would like a commission set up to deal with further education. It's a neglected part of our education.
Gillian, of course, is a Conservative.
And she's a Conservative, and I love her, and I count her as a very good friend. And Gillian got in touch with me, and I chaired this inquiry into further education, and I wrote a report, and we brought it out, and it was about basically seeing the vital importance of training and giving people second chances and developing skills and involving. If you want to regenerate places, that's what you have to do. And so, of course, we're looking at all of this stuff again. But at that time, Labour was just come into government when the report came out, and so for a while it had some capture with the powers that be. But we've never done it well enough, and I hope that we can do it now, because by God, if we're going to do anything in places which are really suffering just now, you really need to give opportunities for people to acquire new skills, and the further education sector is full of terrific people doing great work in that area. And so this Kennedy Foundation is about giving bursaries to people to go from further education into higher education, because they're often people in their 30s or late 20s. They got pregnant when they were 15, or they're boys who got into bits of trouble. And you apply
for
You apply for
funding,
it, and
and you have a board that
and we've got a
decides.
board, and so we give everybody £1,000. It's not exactly going to change the world. It's not paying for everything, but it's so they can buy a computer. It's so they can buy their travel pass. It's so that they can get childcare for bits. So it's a way of easing the passage of people making that transition where they want to acquire real skills to just improve their lives.
And I mean, looking back as we all do, what are the things that have given you the sort of greatest pleasure, where you've ticked the box and said, "Thank good, that really, I really feel I did it there"?
Well, Jonathan, I think I was probably, it's always difficult to sort of talk yourself up, but I played I think an important part in talking about what was happening to women in the justice system, because I started talking about all of that. But I did a chapter in a book when I was in my late 20s about women at the bar, because there was a lot of discrimination. Mm-hmm. Chambers didn't want women and would say we've got one, as if that somehow was enough.
Yeah. And then that moved on to equality,
and it moved on to the whole business.
Because you were involved with the campaign for homosexual equality and all those
all
things.
Those things. But the women at the bar was about saying that we need to have the justice system fails women, and one of the ways in which you can improve that is by having more women in the judiciary, that women should be able to move more seamlessly up through the system, which wasn't happening. But also to look at the ways that law failed women because of the things that we're now talking about, which is that, in sexual offences, that somehow there's a sort of double standard.
And internationally, I mean, we're doing quite a lot, obviously, women in business in the Commonwealth, particularly in Africa at the moment. You've spent a lot of time on that, haven't you?
I have, and I've often spent time. I mean, when the banking crisis happened, I went out for Barclays. I went to a number of different banks to encourage women to rise up, and what the blocks were in women rising within the banking and financial sector, and I've done that a lot in different places because we know that diversity and having more women, having people from different backgrounds and from ethnic minorities actually enriches the nature of the debate inside organisations and the creativity. And you can have McKinsey telling you this, as well as Helena Kennedy, that you actually get better outcomes when you have that kind of mix. And so it's pretty old fashioned not to be diverse.
Going back to the Lords, I mean, do you think you can still get your message across there now as it's currently constituted?
Oh yes, I mean I
mean, you are a whip's nightmare because you voted the highest voter against your own party in Parliament.
Well, that was when Labour was in government. They didn't always do the right thing by the rule of law either. They tried to diminish jury trial and quite considerably, and that was, as far as I was concerned, was a road too far. And I didn't like that they locked up people without trial because of after 9/11 we copied what the Americans were doing, and I didn't like the fact that we were prepared to accept evidence that was based, we were accepting intelligence based on torture, which was leading to the arrest of people. So there were many of those things where I thought that that Labour was also transgressing on the rule of law, just as I think your party is today. And so when people I mean, I'm a lawyer. First and foremost, I believe in protecting the rule of law, protecting human rights and civil liberties, and that's where whatever the complexion of the political party, I'm afraid I'm going to be speaking out about it.
Well, it's brilliant, and the House of Lords is very lucky to have you. Both sides are indeed, and your contribution is always fantastic, and I love listening to you speak. Helena, thanks so much for sparing the time. It's been brilliant. I mean, you are so industrious, and it's just, as I say, I'm exhausted. Just hearing all the things you've done.
I mean, the real challenges at the moment are for me, are around. I'm on this task force on the war crimes in Ukraine. I was busy evacuating women judges from Afghanistan, and we got 103 of them out with their families. But then then the battle became about finding places for them to resettle. And the other areas that I'm dealing with are about, I mean, look at what's happening in Hong Kong and the reach, the long arm of China's reach.
And of course, you're banned from China, aren't you?
I've been sanctioned by the Chinese.
Yes.
I don't have a house on the Yangtze, so my summer holidays are still okay. But it is shocking that when we see that that all over the world rights are being abused, and that's why for Britain to retain a strong hold and commitment to the rule of law is vitally important, and that's why it's so important that we here in our Parliament protect that.
Well, it's fantastic what you do and the energy which you do it, and really appreciate you sparing the time.
No, it's lovely to be with you, Jonathan.